And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 20 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. Okay, guys, I've been working on a few ideas with this series that I've been doing. I was going to do one tonight on sort of the relationship between Mussolini and Hilaire Belloc, Catholic historian. But strangely enough, I'm having trouble finding information on that. I got some information, and I just want to be more clear about what I'm researching on that topic. So I'm going to take a few more days. But what's funny, as I was doing research um, on this, this issue between Mussolini and Hilaire Belloc, I came across a video on the current day fascism in Italy, and I want to do a reaction video tonight. The video is about 20 minutes long, so with my commentary as I start and stop, this could be a long video, but I think there's going to be some important notes to take here in regards to what's going on in Italy. Now, for my part, I really can't talk about too deeply about the current fascist movements in Italy right now. I'm not there. I'm not on the ground. I don't know what's going on. But in this particular video, it is lots of history that is brought to light in order to try and diminish what fascism was, right? It's a BBC kind of documentary with its Western liberal filter that it presents to its audience back in sort of these again in Western liberal societies, particularly I would imagine in England as its primary audience, and trying to diminish what fascism was from a Western liberal perspective. And while you guys know that I'm been critical of Mussolini in many ways historically, I'm also one that believes that we have to keep the critiques fair, right? We have to respect history in that regard. As you know, I've been critical of Mussolini when it comes to his decision to go to war with Hitler in that alliance. I've been critical about corporatism and whether it really could have worked, and the nature of the business cycle and sort of the market forces within the corporatist system. I've been critical about the succession process of fascism, ultimately at the end of the day, and a few other issues. But what I don't take too kindly is when we fabricate these sort of narratives from the Western liberal paradigm that are designed to critique fascism from that, again, Western liberal perspective that oftentimes simply feeds the propaganda narrative of the West, which is very problematic in my opinion, and it does a great disservice to history. And so, we're going to go through this video tonight. I'm going to start, stop. I'm hoping the video doesn't come out too choppy. It's kind of a late reaction here in many ways, but you'll see me start, stop it, and give you commentary and give you my thoughts, particularly breaking down the Western liberal bias here, right? Particularly this British bias. And I think most Americans would probably support this narrative. Don't get me wrong. And here I am as again, Italian American myself to, again, present a little bit more nuance historically, right? Again, I can't go too deep into the current fascist movements in Italy. I could probably speculate into what they're thinking, what they're suffering through today, and why these movements are still alive over there in many ways. But I can deal with the historical aspect of fascism in Italy, and maybe try to give a little bit more balance from this, again, Western liberal kind of perspective. Okay, so hopefully this video comes out okay. Now let's go to the tape here. All right, here we go. This called Fascism is Italy's government allowing the past to live on. Here we go.
Italy 2024, where the battles of the past still smolder.
Are you a fascist? If you ask me like that, I probably would say yes, but I have to complete the term and say I'm a revolutionary.
A march in Milan for a far-right student killed almost 50 years ago by the far left.
You're seeing things in these recent years that are very similar to what happened at the beginning of the regime.
The years of violent clashes between fascists and anti-fascists have gone, but the words and the polarization live on.
Being anti-fascism in Italy means be a violent person who shut the door to all others.
Competing narratives in the country that created fascism.
Calendario più venduto in Italia, questo tra l'altro.
You've got the Mussolini calendar. You said this is the most sold calendar in Italy.
And still allows its sympathizers.
In realtà questi conti l'Italia con il suo passato non li ha mai fatti davvero.
Okay, let me stop there. Fascinating here. Obviously, we're setting up the narrative how this supposed dark history of fascism in Italy still resonates today, as there's many Italians that still are trying to relive the history and revive the history of fascism in Italy. And you see here, this one journalist says that Italy's never really come to terms with its past, right? Dealing with the fact that the criminal elements, as you'll see later on in this video, that are brought up of fascism is something that the Italians have always avoided, right? Unlike the Germans who had to deal with it in many ways, the Italians never really did. And it's fascinating to me because when I hear that Italy has never dealt with its past in regards to fascism, the immediate thing that comes to my mind is that nothing has really changed in Italy when fascism arose starting in the late 19 teens, right? As Bolshevik revolutionaries were moving into Italy and how to respond to those Bolshevik revolutionaries in many ways. And this is me speculating here about modern day sort of fascist movements in Italy. It's very similar here. We see that Italy has, since the end of World War II, has been infiltrated by both Western liberal republics and by communism over the past 70 to 80 years. The country has been sort of adversely gone backwards in many ways, politically, culturally, socially, right? Especially now with this weaponized migration that's being forced into all Western European nations. And in many ways, because fascism was a nationalist movement rather than an internationalist movement here, they're reacting and pushing back against some of the dictates of liberalism. The very same things that fascism was pushing back against in the 1920s and the 1930s, right? But again, if you don't see this from a liberal perspective, right? If you are an internationalist as a far leftist kind of ideologue within the realm of Italy, of course, you're going to oppose all these ideas, see the negative connotations of fascism, when in fact, you could probably argue that fascism, which is a nationalist movement, is something akin to a patriotic movement within the realm of Italy. Now, how we govern within that factor, or how Italy governs within the realm of fascism, that is something we have to take on, right? Let's keep going on.
As it draws to a close, the finale, with a chilling throwback to Italy's dictatorship decades.
These kinds of demonstrations with the fascist salutes happen across the country year in, year out. The state allows them to take place, and society somehow seems to tolerate them. I want to find out why, and why some of the images associated with the dark chapters of Italy's past still infuse the present.
Okay, stop right there. Fascinating. You'll see throughout the course of this documentary, this particular journalist here, who's the lead journalist in this documentary, will always refer back to the fascist salute, right? That they just showed there, and how all these, again, Italian citizens show up to these events to support historical fascism, and they're doing this dreaded fascist salute, right? Which is supposed to be a negative connotation because that salute represents something of the past that was tyrannical and it was related to certain crimes in that era of human history. But here's the funny thing about it is the fascist salute was nothing more than the Roman salute. Remember, Mussolini was Roman. He was born in the Romagna province, about 50 miles south of Rome. That's why Mussolini was always a Roman. The fascist salute was simply nothing more than the Roman salute that preceded fascism for 2,000 years. This is simply the history and the tradition of Italy. It is a cultural thing over there and really has nothing to do per se with fascism other than this allegiance to Italian culture, history, and tradition. And yet here with the BBC reporter, he's trying to make this thing something bigger than what it was, right? When it's fact, it's just Italians celebrating Italian history. Really no bigger difference than, say, Americans putting their hands over their heart and saying the Pledge of Allegiance. That's all this was, really. So there you go. Let's move on.
For the hardcore believers, a return to where it, or rather he, began. The small town of Predappio in northeast Italy, the birthplace of Benito Mussolini, the country's fascist dictator, assassinated in 1945 after a ruthless 20-year rule. Every year on the anniversary of his death, the faithful gather to honor him, not for them the established narrative of his reign of terror. Down the road, Mussolini merge. From the traditional to the tacky, an extraordinary world of dictatorship kitsch.
Can you imagine an equivalent place existing in Germany selling Hitler and Nazi paraphernalia? It just wouldn't happen. This is extraordinary. It's Mussolini marketing, and it sells.
Okay, you gotta love it. You see the comparison to the failed Austrian painter again, and I guess it's fair to a certain degree because Mussolini did align himself. They fought that war, and ultimately, from the Western liberal perspective, right? Um, Again, two authoritarian leaders, they fight in a war together, and effectively you try and make them almost into the same character when we know there was big differences between Mussolini and Hitler. Particularly, Mussolini never really liked Hitler, and ultimately it was an alliance of political convenience. Now, I think it, again, as I said to start this cast, I think it's fair to critique Mussolini for entering that war and bringing Italy to its end, not only his end, not only Italy's end, but his end as well too, right? But the comparison, right? When you look at something like Nazi Germany, and I know there was a lot of social engineering in Germany after the war, but there's just a different feel here. And what the narrative has been with many sort of post-liberal interpretations of Italian fascism is that Italy did not get the blame that it deserved after the war, unlike the Nazis did, right? Because the Nazis were tyrannical, aligned with Italy. Italy should have got the blame as well, too. But when you look at things on the ground and how they happen in Italy, Germany and Italy were different. And so you're going to bring up the Holocaust, something that never happened in Italy. You could say it passed the 1938 discrimination laws. They were fundamentally different in discrimination laws. In Germany, they're going to bring up this comparison pretty soon. But notice the association, right? You tie Mussolini to Hitler, hence Hitler evil. That makes Mussolini evil as well, too.
Then it begins. Part funeral procession, part military parade. A pilgrimage to his resting place. They're called to attention. And then silence for their victim. They file in towards his tomb. We're not welcome.
We don't know.
ammiro e stimo la persona.
Ma non era un criminale?
Chi l'ha detto che era un criminale? Che se le 3 regole, Dio, patria, famiglia, rispettare le regole, portare il debito dello Stato al 0, l'INPS, la maternità, pagare vuol dire essere criminale, allora forse puoi dire che era un criminale, ma non lo era. Sono mamma, sono nonna, sono cristiana, non sono drogata, non ho mai infranto la legge, ho sempre pagato le tasse. Se tu dici che sì, io sono fascista, ti dico sì. Se tutto questo vuol dire essere fascista, sì, lo sono. Io
That's a fascinating response there, right? He asked the question, well, wasn't he a criminal? And her response is, well, basically, yeah, he passed social security measures. He paid mother's maternity, right? He did he balanced the budget. He didn't run deficits. Mussolini ran a real economy. She says, if that's, if that's a crime, then so be it. I guess he was a criminal. And it goes back to the nature of Mussolini, who he was as the head of state, right? Because the greater charge is going to be is that, right, you had fascism that was running violence all throughout of Italy during the 1920s and 30s. Hence, we blame Mussolini and his founding of fascism, sort of for those crimes. Again, never is it mentioned here that they're fighting communists and Bolsheviks in the street. It goes back to even earlier in this documentary here about the violence, about those supposed anti-fascists, right? It's kind of like, and you'll see it here later on, the partisans in Italy during the 1920s and 30s that opposed fascism. The one thing that's never mentioned about the partisans is that many of them, if not most of them, were communists, right? A lot of them being sent in from the Soviet Union, just like we saw in Spain, just like they had those same problems in Germany in a certain respect, right? Never is that mentioned. It's the fascists versus the anti-fascists, when in fact you could argue that it's really the fascists versus the communists, to be honest, or far leftists, to say the very least. And so what was fascism? It was God, it was country, it was family. That was the idea behind it, the central tenets behind it that Mussolini pushed. This lady here is saying basically that I'm a Christian, I'm a taxpayer, I haven't broken any laws. I appreciate what Mussolini did, what he stood for. He was a nationalist. He cared about Italy. And these are all attributes that I think are fair when it comes to Mussolini, right? I think there is some questions in regards to, how does the law in regards to certain elements of individual rights break down? I think that's one of the critiques of fascism. And we'll probably have to go deeper into that to see if there was an abuse of power by the fascist regime. But as I said before, just like in America today, we haven't really stopped the push of Marxism, cultural Marxism, communism in America, because we're all waiting for, some moments of awakening when it comes to sort of the American voting electorate. In Europe, they were done. In Italy, they were done talking games because of the corrupt nature of democracy and its inability to stop revolutions, leftist revolutions in this country. So the question is, when the fascist ideology rises to confront the far leftist revolutionaries within Italy, as we saw in Spain, as we saw in Germany, as we saw in Austria, as we saw in Portugal, what is the proper response? Is it simply a constitution, thump, 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 constitution, thump, thump, thump? Or do you actually take action? In Italy, they decided to take action. And this offends our liberal sensibilities because we reside everything within the realm of the democratic process. That's where we solve our process, because democracy and sort of parliamentary government is a quasi-religion of sorts. And that is the metric by which we're always going down, even if it takes traditional values and nationalism down the drain with it, right? So this is important to remember here, is that the difference being is in Italy in 1920s and 30s, they were done talking with the leftists. They were willing to challenge them, not just in the battle arena of ideas where communists always win at the end of the day, but they were willing to challenge him in the streets, to take back their society, to take back their culture at the end of the day. And this is important to remember, whether you like violence in the streets or not, it's going to happen in the political system. It just will. It always has. The nature of politics has always been violence. Whether we like it or not, we try and maintain peace as much as we can, obviously. But when your values, your society, your culture, your patriotic duties are all being overrun by internationalist movements that are trying to bring in a global order, how do you respond? How? Right? Especially as Americans today, many of us are questioning what's going on here, right? Even, and I can't really say it on YouTube, but with some elements of politics. Let's put it that way. Let's continue on.
Romanamente saluto il mio capo di Stato, unico e solo capo di Stato.
In Milan, Mussolini made an important statement on the question.
It's a salute deriving from ancient Rome, adopted by the fascists and passed on to the Nazis. Benito Mussolini, nicknamed Il Duce, or the leader, swept to power in 1922, beginning 2 decades of totalitarian rule, marked by a brutal repression of opponents, concentration camps, and invasions abroad.
He came by armored train for the meeting with Senior Mussolini.
Anti-Semitic laws persecuted Jews, worsening after Italy's wartime alliance with Hitler's Germany.
From Germany, unless he wanted something.
Okay, there's a lot there to unravel. Obviously, he goes back to a German salute. Excuse me, he goes back to the Roman salute, and he clarifies that it goes back to ancient Rome. So you see what we've done here? First, we attribute the Roman salute to fascism as something of a negative connotation, but then he has to clear up what the Roman salute actually is. A little bit of this dishonesty there, right? We get into the different supposed crimes of fascism there, particularly its suppression of sort of political activity. Again, no mention of the infiltration of communists at the time. It's concentration camps. Again, the context of war. No mention that everybody had concentration camps in those days, including the Americans, the British, the Germans, the Japanese. Everybody had them in those days. No mention of, or at least contextualizing what the concentration camps were in the midst of war. And of course, the idea of conquest, which is mainly what happened most likely in Ethiopia, maybe in Libya as well too. But again, a lack of clarity as colonization was happening all over the world by all nations of the world, including, the dreaded British Empire, who had, again, the empire where the sun never set, right? They say that if you started at the northern tip of Africa, you go walk all the way down to the southern tip in South Africa and never leave either British or French colonies on the entire continent of France. So everybody was fine with colonization until Italy did it, right? Okay, good. So let's move on. And listen, I don't want to minimize the colonization thing, right? And how that took place. And I think, again, there, Mussolini is open to criticism in a certain respect. But I've talked about Ethiopia before, and there's a greater context about the problems of Ethiopia, especially with Mussolini being a big proponent in the early to mid-20s of supporting Ethiopia's entrance into the United Nations, or I think it was the League of Nations back then. It was only after a big kerfuffle with the British and the inability of Ethiopia to get its issues straightened out and attacking the Italian post in the Somaliland, Italy, that it really forced Mussolini's hand. Again, there's more nuance. There's more geopolitics going on. This sort of abstract idea of the conquest of Italy, right? The conquest of Mussolini, that needs to be cleared up. Of course, they don't, because it doesn't fit the narrative of this documentary.
After the war, a neo-fascist party was allowed to form, and figures from the Mussolini era filled state institutions. The party remained sidelined until Silvio Berlusconi brought it into his coalition, legitimizing the extreme.
Li abbiamo fatti entrare noi nel 94, li abbiamo legittimati noi, li abbiamo costituzionalizzati noi.
Today, the black shirt salutes fill various yearly tributes. They say it's historical commemoration. Critics call it glorification of past crimes.
Okay, so is it commemoration or is it glorification of the past, right? You could probably argue it's a little bit of both. I think the problem is, again, Italy has been mired in Western liberalism and communist influence now since the end of World War II. And as these liberal republics continue to deteriorate Western values, what is the response? What's been the response in America from the political right, from, again, these extreme leftist movements in America? It's been an extreme form of patriotism, looking back to the founding principles, right? You got the black shirts in Italy, but you got the red, white, and blue in America, right? We got an election coming around. Look around your town. There's Trump flags flying all around, American flags flying all around, because this is an opposition force to the liberal status quo, right? What is the right in Italy? That's the question, because they don't see politics in terms of, again, these classical liberal values of the founding Enlightenment principles. In some ways, fascism is the right. It's different in America, right? The right in Europe than it is in America. America is tied to the Enlightenment. A lot of these right-wing movements in Europe are not tied to the Enlightenment. You got to remember that. But if they're looking for something in the past to draw back from, to find national pride, to find a sense of sanity, I see the same thing in America today. People are looking to the past, something that's familiar, something that's comforting, something that, again, resonates within the culture of American society and brings them hope, apart from these far leftist movements now, these globalist movements, right, that have taken over the world in many respects. So again, we're trying to present a dark shadow over these groups over there. And again, I don't have nothing to do with them. I don't know a whole lot about them. There's a lot of speculation on my part. But just as you have your patriotic duties in Western liberal nations, you have patriotic fervor still in these nations. And they're looking for something that made more sense from them than these, again, far leftist movements now that dominate all of the West.
Il fascismo non è morto nel 1945, è stato sconfitto militarmente, ma ha continuato a vivere nella pancia di molti italiani. Mi chiamo Paolo Berizzi, sono giornalista, mi occupo di...
So that's a great question. Did fascism die after 1945? Actually, I think the question is, did it? Yeah, in 1945, excuse me, I get my days confused. After Mussolini was effectively assassinated by partisans. That's a great question. I tend to believe that it did die. From my reading of Italian fascism and Mussolini, because fascism was so uniquely Italian, right? Regardless of what you have in France, or excuse me, in Spain or in Germany or in Austria or Portugal, fascism was uniquely Italian. And so in many ways, we could bring up some of the fascist philosophers like Giovanni Gentili, but in many ways, it was Benito Mussolini that really brought fascism to the forefront. And that's what makes, in my opinion, fascism, Italian fascism, so different and so unique in many ways, is the fact that it was Mussolini and how he led Italy at that time, and some of the more interesting things he did throughout his governance. So to me, in my mind, and I could be wrong here, Mussolini is fascism and fascism is Mussolini. This is why I question what is the succession process of fascism. Because one of the things that I have heard about the current fascist regimes is they're secular movements over there. When we know that Mussolini, toward the end of his life, made a big push. He became a Catholic. He gave the glory and the honor back to the church during his reign, basically made the church the third stool of American politics, along with, again, the fascist head of state and the king over there. And so is fascism, again, can fascism, apart from Catholicism, work? I don't think so, because I think it's that tie with the Catholic Church that gives it the right sort of spirit to follow natural law that makes it uniquely different from Western liberalism and communism, right? I find it fascinating as a Catholic precisely because Mussolini brought the church into the fold, despite the headbutting that many people sort of complain about. At the end of the day, Mussolini was good with the church. And the reason why we know that is that when he was put in charge of the Republic of Salo, if you read the unpublished Constitution of the Republic of Salo, he put the church in as sort of the integralist, sort of moral voice of the Republic of Salo, right? The Republic of Salo, I think, only lasted 20 months, but there was no need for Mussolini to proclaim the church as sort of the head of the Republic of Salo if this faith wasn't coming around. And this doesn't even get into the Lateran Accords, which happened in 1929, which again, I think is something that's overlooked, something that should be considered by Catholics with great prominence, the fact that he gave the glory back to the church, its rightful place in society. I'm trying to read into the relation between church and state at that time, because Catholics will automatically say, okay, well, Mussolini was at fault, Catholic action. You have that encyclical Non abbiamo bisogno, which critiques Mussolini, right, over Catholic action, which is the Catholic youth. But there was politics involved in all of this. And recently, and I got to verify this, I heard a comment that some people believe the church was pushing a little bit too hard over the fascist state. And that was because the church was now being infiltrated by far left ideologues, right? Remember Mussolini's battle with Don Sturzo, the Sicilian far leftist priest that was pushing Marxism in Sicily and really throughout the rest of Europe. You got to remember, these are battles of the left and the right, and how the left kind of embeds itself in every part of society. That was still happening. While many of the Bolsheviks were pushed out, there was still, again, as Marxists operate in grand secret, right? Covertly, right? There were still these battles. And in many ways, the church was already being affected by this. While the hierarchy and the papacy was still very orthodox, the sort of underlings within the church, there might have been some problems. Now, I can't say for sure, but it's what I've been reading lately. So the government had to deal with this, right?
Di neofascismo, di neonazismo, e da quasi 6 anni vivo sotto scorta per minacce neofasciste e neonaziste. È una vita blindata. Vuol dire che tu al ristorante, al cinema, a teatro sei sempre accompagnato dai tuoi agenti di scorta. 100 anni dopo l'inizio del fascismo, cioè la marcia su Roma, chi fa il mio lavoro, un cronista, sia costretto a vivere e lavorare sotto scorta. Io penso che questa sia una sconfitta per lo Stato.
Okay, journalists here critique or critical of fascism here, says he's under constant protection because of death threats. Okay, fair enough. If that's really happening, it's completely wrong in that sense, right? But let's remember where most of the violence comes from. It comes from the far left. We've seen it here in America with groups like Antifa of all people, right? The Antifa movement that burned down cities whenever they're called upon at any given moment.
In realtà questi conti l'Italia con il suo passato non li ha mai fatti davvero. Nel pensiero comune si è depositata l'idea che in qualche modo il fascismo ha fatto anche cose buone, che Mussolini ha fatto delle cose accettabili, utili al paese.
Okay, again, an attempt to diminish the historical tenets of fascism, right? Because some people say that Mussolini did good things. He's kind of trying to, shed a light here and say, no, fascism really didn't do anything. It couldn't have done anything because it was tyrannical in nature. And of course, some people would beg to differ with that interpretation, when in fact, there was some things that you could probably look at throughout that period of history, the first of which was simply unifying Italy and making Italy into a nation. Remember, the question Romana, right? The question Romana that no other political leader had ever solved, and that is, what are Italians after the 18, the revolution of the 1860s, right? A bunch of provinces, all these languages and traditions and different peoples brought together into this, into this Italian peninsula, where nobody knows what really an Italian is for the most part. It's an artificial construct of the byproduct of revolution. It was Mussolini at the very least, and this is at the very least, that made Italy Italy. Everybody acknowledges that. He settled the question Romana. He did it by bringing the church in 1929 Lateran Accords. The moment the church is brought in, there is something that unifies all the different districts and provinces, and that is Catholicism. That is the faith. Some people will say that, well, he just used the Catholic Church in order to, again, consolidate his power. Maybe he did, but he did unify Italy by bringing the church in. Remember, political leaders in Italy tried for decades before Mussolini to try and solve the question Romana, and that is, what is the church's role in Italy? Mussolini did it, and by doing this, in many respects, united Italy as a nation. Whether you agree with that or not, that's what he did. A lot of people will say that's a great accomplishment.
Italy's post-war constitution has one article that bans reforming the fascist party. The subsequent so-called Scelba law forbids groups pursuing the same anti-democratic aims, glorifying fascism, using violence to do so, or promoting the suppression of freedom. But it's only been used twice to dissolve fringe movements, and it leaves it up to judges to decide whether acts like the salute are a crime. Many think the law could have been used after this, protests over COVID restrictions that attacked Italy's main trade union. It was seen as out of the fascist playbook, since the unions were targeted under Mussolini. Forza Nuova took part that day, a fringe hard-right party still not banned.
Okay, I'm not familiar with Forza Nuova, but look here, the association with the pandemic that we had, where Italians were locked down to an extreme in that country. It was the fascist groups that rose up against that, and yet we give this a negative connotation, right? When we, in retrospect now, there's lots of questions about the pandemic, right? But notice the spin here. Notice the spin, because they stood up to this sort of tyrannical rule. This is a negative thing, right? Again, the BBC being a far left entity, supporting the narrative that has been given by the liberal governments of the West, tries to cast a negative light. I don't see that as a problem by these fascist groups here. That's all I say, because I can't say much more on this particular topic, on this platform. In fact, I might have said too much.
Hi. Wow. Well, this is
Luca Castellini, its deputy leader, was jailed for the violence, but freed pending appeal.
flag up here of the Donetsk people.
Esatto, Donbass,
In Ukraine, the part of Ukraine taken by Russia, or claimed by Russia.
è la parte dell'Ucraina che è russa. Il calendario più venduto in Italia, questo tra l'altro.
You've got the Mussolini calendar. You said this is the most sold calendar in Italy.
No, lo dico io, lo dicono I dati.
We are fascists. The call to arms. We are fascists. And then up here, this is of course, the flag of the
Repubblica Sociale, sì.
fascist republic.
Io ve lo dico.
This was also Luca Castellini.
So that's interesting. Mussolini's calendar is the best-selling calendar in Italy. I don't know what that means, other than obviously there's some admiration, some reverence there for Mussolini still. Obviously in the West, we've been given a liberal narrative on Italian fascism. All I could think of is, again, in his 21-year reign between 1922 and 1943, from my understanding, there was never no serious challenge to his governance in Italy, right? Remember, Mussolini wasn't the final arbiter. He wasn't the final authority in Italy. The king was. The king could have deposed Mussolini like he did in 1943 anytime he wanted to if his leadership, his governance was ineffective. So that's what I find fascinating about this is that maybe the Italians have a different view. I know some people in Italy that tell me that Mussolini is not universally hated in Italy to this day. Yes, you have your far leftist groups, your academics, your fringe leftist groups, and your Marxists are very prevalent over there that despise him and explain history in kind of in a negative light. But there's another side to the Italian population, and apparently here with these calendars, maybe it's an indication, right?
Chi ha permesso questa serata? Chi ha pagato tutto? Chi ha fatto la garanzia a un nome? Adolf Hitler!
As head of Verona's Ultras, Italy's hardcore football fans, long a breeding ground of extremism. He's been banned from the stadium after saying a black player could never be truly Italian.
Do you think it's acceptable to joke about Adolf Hitler?
Ma non è questione di giocare, io potevo dire anche Stalin, potevo dire Pol Pot, potevo dire qualsiasi altro dittatore della storia. Era una battuta ed è stata considerata tale dal tribunale, ricordi, che mi ha assolto. Quindi,
Would you say this?
Okay, I'm not sure what the joke was. I didn't understand it. Obviously, he refutes back and says, okay, listen, it could have been Pol Pot, it could have been Stalin. You know, he kind of shoots back on the other side, right? So, okay, let's move on.
Same thing again.
vuol dire che si può fare assolutamente,
You
certo.
would repeat the same thing.
Ripetere, vuol dire che non è un reato.
What would you say to a Jewish person, an Italian Jewish person who lost their family to the Holocaust?
Ma non so come la può pensare, ma voglio dire, ce ne sono di popoli che hanno avuto le persone morte in guerra, o cioè, voglio dire, le guerre ci sono sempre state e ci sono sempre stati morti.
Okay, so as is always the case, the Jewish question comes up in the context of what happened in Europe during that period of time. Eventually, here in this video, they'll bring up the 1938 discrimination laws against the Jews, even though it was not universal against all Jews, right? There's some issues there, things that don't look good in light of history. I would agree with that. But I think, again, the question of the Jews separate from the governance of Italy and ultimately into World War II are separate issues that need to be analyzed separately. At the end of the day, right, I think we can all agree that all people deserve a certain sense of human dignity, including Jews. I'll be the first to tell you. At the same time, if you have adversaries within your own society, what do you do with that, right? I mean, the question with Jews has always been, do they have a revolutionary liberal spirit, right? Maybe that's what Mussolini was thinking. Listen, I read Renzo Di Felice's book, The Jews in Fascist Italy. It's a book that's not well liked by modern academics because it doesn't go hard enough against Mussolini and his 1938 discrimination laws. I actually have a thesis that I haven't proven yet, but I do believe that Mussolini was saving the Jews from Hitler. That's my opinion, because we saw that later on, even after the discrimination laws were passed in 1938, when Hitler was calling for the Jews in France, in territory that was controlled by the Italians, and in Yugoslavia, other territories controlled by Italy during the war. Mussolini did not send the Jews to Hitler. He had heard what was going on in the treatment over there and some of the problems over there, and he commanded his generals not to send any Jews to Hitler. He said, lie, obfuscate, break railroads, do what you got to do. In fact, in France in 1943, the Italian authorities in the region they control passed a law that forbidded the Jews from wearing the Star of David, so they could not be singled out by the Nazis at the end of the day. Mussolini, whatever you may think of the 1938 laws, vindicates himself later on in 1943 in France and in Yugoslavia. It's something nobody ever talks about. It's something nobody ever mentions. Mussolini was not his fascism was not race-based, right? Mussolini had Jewish generals, he had Jewish lovers, right? Jews were prominent in Italy, but once you get to war, and this is the great dispute, why does he pass the 38 laws? Is it simply to consolidate the alliance with Hitler? Because he passes the law 2 months after he signs the Pact of Steel at that point, right? And so why does he pass it? Again, I would tend to speculate that, and I could be completely off on this, and I can't prove it, I'll be honest with you. I think because of the nature of the laws, first of all, it was not all Jews. It was a good portion of them. They were sent to temporary camps to where they could find a new place to live, but the law forbade them from being shipped off to Germany. What happens at the Republic of Salo, that's where they try to get Mussolini, because of the 7,500 Jews that were sent to Auschwitz. Only 115, I believe, made it back alive after the war. That was Salo, right? That wasn't Mussolini in Italy. That was a puppet regime that he had very little control of. And even there at Salo, when Mussolini found out that the SS were coming in to take these 7,500, roughly 7,500 Italian Jews, Mussolini ordered his Minister of Interior to put out a 24-hour notice via radio broadcast to tell the Jews to get out. And they had 24 hours. Obviously, Nazis came in, took them to their camps. Horrible story. They died in Auschwitz. So the thing with the Jews is a mixed record, right? I think if you want to blame Mussolini for terrible discrimination laws in 1938, I think that's very fair. But I'd like to see the counterbalance, right? Mussolini protecting Jews from Hitler, from the Germans. He did that. That is never mentioned. That is always omitted, right? Right? And again, even his 38 discrimination laws were designed to get Jews out of the country, away from Germany. I think the other problem is too, and I think we're starting to figure out this in modern politics, is that with Jews, their alliance is always divided between the nation of origin and Zionism, right? The understanding, the ideal of what Israel is. This is one of the issues that always bothered Mussolini, by the way, which, again, we're not allowed to talk about. I get it, right? In polite company, this is not a conversation we're allowed to have. I get it. But this is real for Mussolini and many of the European nations. That's why Mussolini always said, listen, I don't care what race you are. As long as you talk Italian, you are a good Italian, but your loyalties need to be to Italy. Remember, he was a nationalist, right? As long as your loyalties are to Italy, then you're an Italian. You're a good Italian. You're welcomed here. The problem with the Jews, again, is that their loyalties were always divided. And we see that today in modern politics concerning the state of Israel, right? Not to say that all Jews are bad. I'm not arguing that at all. I'm just saying that this is a real dilemma.
No government has cracked down. But some feel Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is even less likely to do so.
Giorgia a 19 ans.
She started in politics in the neo-fascist youth, interviewed aged 19 by French TV.
Moi, je crois que Mussolini, c'était un bon politicien. C'est-à-dire que tout ce qu'il a fait pour l'Italie. Et on ne le trouve pas, ça, dans les politiciens qu'on a eu dans les dernières 50 ans.
The party she formed, Brothers of Italy, has its roots in post-war fascism, keeping the same tricolor flame logo. But she has moderated and moved it away from the far right to the mainstream. She's topping polls before the upcoming European elections, an example for Europe's nationalist politicians hoping she'll lead a new right-wing wave and hoping to emulate her success in their countries. And on the past, she had this message.
The Italian right has handed fascism over history for decades now, unambiguously condemning the suppression of democracy and the ignominious anti-Jewish laws.
Il mondo neofascista italiano, l'estrema
Okay,
destra,
let me stop there. Maloney, let's talk about her for a second. Obviously, we have the quote when she's 19 years old about Mussolini did a bunch of good things for Italy. Obviously, you could tell there she had some admiration for Mussolini, agreed with some of the dictates of Italian fascism of the past. Now she's the leader of Italy and she's moderated. Okay, a couple ways we can look at this. On one hand, you can say, okay, she was 19 years old. Obviously, she's matured. Her political philosophies probably evolved like all of our political philosophies evolved. And now she's kind of seen the light with the problems of fascism. And she's become more of a moderate, as this narrative guy, this guy here says. Fine. I think that's a fair assessment. I think most likely what is the case is that in her heart, Giorgia Meloni probably still likes Mussolini and a lot of things he did. Right? The problem is it's not politically expedient when you're the leader of a democratic nation. So what do? You have to distance yourself from that, right? That's most likely what's going on here. This we are in Western liberal republics, right? The will of the people, democracy, all that stuff that we push in the West. That's what won after World War II. You're not going to go in there, be elected, and then be in favor of totalitarian rule, even though the left seems to do that. Don't get me wrong, without stating the obvious facts, but that's what I think of that.
I gruppi dichiaratamente neofascisti si sono sentiti sdoganati con l'avvento del governo Meloni, perché quei simboli, quelle battaglie, quegli slogan che per anni erano tenuti in qualche modo ai bordi del campo, fuori dal perimetro della politica istituzionale, di colpo vengono legittimati. Giorgia Meloni e come lei i suoi colonnelli non riescono a definirsi antifascisti. Questo è il dato su cui riflettere. Nel momento in cui tu non riesci a definirti antifascista in una repubblica nata dall'antifascismo, evidentemente vuol dire che hai qualche problema a farlo.
Okay, so they can't call themselves anti-fascist, right? You're trying to pigeonhole somebody to the label of fascism and the purported crimes of fascism historically. Obviously, the Brothers of Italy, which is the party of Giorgia Meloni, has that fascist symbol still to this day. They haven't removed it. What does that mean? Are they crypto-fascists? Are they just giving us lip service to how they've renounced fascism, but they're keeping the symbol? Do they agree with some elements of fascism? Are they able to say that? Are they not able to say that? Are they kind of walking a fine line? Yeah, they may be. I mean, this is the bottom line. What is the right in Europe? See, and that's what we don't understand in America, right? Is that we're tied to the Enlightenment. They're not tied to the Enlightenment. Fascism was a rejection of the Enlightenment. And in many ways, all the far leftist movements that now dominate Western Europe, including Italy, you need a true opposing force. You can't do that with freedom, liberty. That facilitates the power of far leftist organizations. That's what they figured out. How does Giorgia Meloni and current more conservative governments deal? It's a balancing act, because in many ways, fascism represents the right in many ways in Europe.
But Meloni's supporters say the issue is with the way in which anti-fascists have protested over the years, both in clashes with the other side and with police.
Being anti-fascist during the fascism was a very brave act, a brave of freedom, a brave for democracy. But after the falling of the fascism, being anti-fascist means violence, means a lot of young students killed. This is why she's very clear. I always condemned the fascism every day of my life. But please don't tell me to share what the anti-fascists did it after the falling of fascism.
If somebody looks from outside and they see Italy in 2024 with hundreds of people in the main second city of Italy putting the fascist salute,
How do you think that looks?
You are fascist if you want to reintroduce the fascism in your country, not if you make the fascism salute. That is the Roman salute. We condemn the fascism, but more than this, it's an obsession.
Okay, let's stop there. You see what's going on there? Again, he brings up the Roman salute. That is a condemnation of fascism. Yet this gentleman here clears it up, says that's the Roman salute, right? It's not necessarily the fascist salute, it's the Roman salute, right? Now we're talking about as well is these anti-fascist groups. And how do you deal with these? Because they're violent, right? What is Antifa in America, right? They're violent groups. This is the tactics they take. And the question is, how do you deal with this? In America, we really haven't dealt with it, right? The right has kind of backed off. The Antifa movement has some support from certain nefarious elements of our society. And whenever they're marched out with marching orders, they cause violence in order to intimidate. Obviously, here, Italy is dealing with the same things. These are far left groups that are called out, marched out whenever they need to oppose anything. And the question here is what is proper and just protest? What is proper and just, again, the right to express your political opinion? And here, these far leftist groups, most likely Marxists, are doing what they've always done. They use violence to intimidate everybody in order to pursue a far leftist progressive agenda.
And so one side of Italy sees fascism and its threat as a ghost haunting the present, the other as a fantasy whipped up by the left.
Across Italy, the past, politically speaking, lives on. Historical battles still part of the present. We come to Bologna, which has always been at the center of the fight against fascism. Here are the names and faces of the partisans that died defending this city from the fascists in the 1940s. But then it went on to 1980 with Italy's worst terror attack, bombings at the train station here in Bologna by neo-fascists that killed 85 people. And so fascism and anti-fascism have always been at the heart of this city's, this country's political lexicon.
Okay, the partisans, obviously there, that died in response to fascism during the World War II period. A lot of them were basically communist groups. That's what they were. They never mentioned that. I think you might have had some different camps in there. Some were not purely communist, but they were probably socialists of some kind. Let's remember that. The bombing in 1980, I don't even know anything about that. If it's real, if it wasn't real, what were the forces behind it? I don't know. It could have been fascist groups. It could have been some extreme fascist groups that have evolved over the years and have felt that extremism is the way to go to make a giant point in a nation now that's been consumed by Western liberalism and communism. So there you go. So there's, but I mean, the point here is that both sides here are being accused of being violent at the end of the day. So I don't know about how far I can vouch for the credibility of the fascist violence. I'm sure it has happened, like I said, with extreme groups, but I think with the left, it's pretty clear cut because they've done this in every nation across the West, including England and America, right? So that's why this sort of parallel to compare and contrast the violence of fascists and the violence of anti-fascists, I have questions about it. I have questions because of the liberal paradigm that this documentary presents, not to exonerate any bad things that fascists have done, how far they went. Obviously, in the killing of the politician Matteo in 1926, I think the fascists went too far. And I think they deserve the blame there. And a few guys went to jail as a result of that. And so, you know, but again, when you're on the streets fighting, a lot of this stuff becomes subjective. This is a war of civilization at the end of the day.
We're seeing things in these recent years that are very similar to what happened at the beginning of the regime and at the beginning of fascism a century ago. Attacks on freedom of press, censorship, freedom for the LGBTQI community, attacks on the liberty and freedom of women to determine what they can do on their own body.
So do you feel that the fight, the anti-fascism fight, is still relevant today?
Definitely. I definitely believe it's very relevant. And I also see, again, to strike a parallel, the fact that the far right, not only in Italy, but all over the world, is sort of trying to find a scapegoat for people's difficulties in everyday lives by attacking the stranger, the person who comes from abroad, the migrant. It's something similar again to what was done a century ago. Germany in some ways sort of had to address the past because there was victors and those who had lost the war. Italy's role was a little more ambiguous, right? So first with Hitler and then surrendered, and there's much to be said about really grappling with that legacy.
Okay, let's stop right there. I mean, what this young lady points out here is it's one liberal trope after another, okay? Weaponized migration. Weaponized migration. She doesn't see that as a problem. She sees that as a lack of tolerance, diversity. She sees it as bigotry. Well, I mean, is that the case? Should a nation have borders? Again, the fascists were nationalists, right? I just don't think that if you're concerned about your nation being overran by migrants in a method where they're being shipped in by nefarious forces, I'm not sure that's a negative connotation against fascism. Okay, number one. Okay, women and suppression of women, right? This goes back to Italy as a Catholic nation and the strict definition or understanding of gender roles within the realm of a Catholic society, right? The patriarchy was a real thing in Catholic cultures, and it was a healthy thing. Listen, my grandmother was from that society. She raised a family in that society. All my father's brothers and sisters and siblings, my grandparents, from my dad's side, they were all born and raised in that society. Women understood the social structures, and women were much more happy to play a more natural role, inclined to natural law, than a liberal society that has feminized women to such a degree that women are absolutely miserable in our society at this point. Again, this is feminism talking here on full display, right? Those women of that culture, of that society, they had a role, they understood it. The family worked better in that society, the culture, everything worked better. It was a healthy society at that time in Italy. My family came from that society. We had an understanding of natural roles. We could define what a man and a woman was. We could define what families were in a true black and white sense. You fast forward 70 years with the onset of liberalism and feminism. Are we better off? Is the family in a stronger place? Is the culture in a stronger place? We can't even define what a woman is. We can't even define what a man is. We have kids chopping off their genitalias in this society precisely because the role of the sexes have been so disoriented in liberal society. Is there anything there that's really of a negative connotation against fascism when it comes to sort of, what they claim was the suppression of women? No. Again, I don't see it there. And finally, the other thing was the LGBT community, right? Again, it was a Catholic nation. The church condemned that issue, always has. Remember, homosexuality in Catholic societies, as condemned by the church, homosexuality is considered one of the great four sins that cries out for God's vengeance here, right? Marxism introduced the idea of sort of the normalization of homosexuality, while the fascists fought against it. Again, is there a problem there? Or is this young lady simply, as the mayor here, deputy mayor of Bologna, or she's simply being a liberal politician? Of any of those three issues, is there something that fascism there should really be condemned for? Not really. It's a liberal spin. And it's an issue that many American conservatives would agree with, actually, at the end of the day. See, this is the BBC. This is the liberal bias. This is the Western liberal filter I talk about.
History is weaponized in a country still not at peace with its past. sugarcoating the bitter parts of collective memory. Nostalgia given free rein.
My name is Roberto Fiore, and I'm the National Secretary of Forza Nuova. I define myself as someone who really, who has certainly got some ideas and some inspiration by certain part of fascism.
Are you a fascist?
If you ask me like that, I probably would say yes, but I have to complete the term and say I'm a revolutionary.
But are you denying that the fascist regime was violent and criminal?
Yes, absolutely, I deny.
Mussolini signed the racial laws. I mean, he deported, that this was a regime that deported Jews to death camps, that outlawed the opposition, that put political opponents in internment camps. Are you honestly saying that you support those measures?
The internment camps are things that happened with the war. The Americans did it, the Germans did it, the Italians did it, and so on.
Talking about people who were gassed, who were shot, who were exterminated for their religion.
Fascism has never been accused of this. I'm talking about fascism as a regime. Mussolini and all his ministers have never been tried for this.
Do you believe that?
Okay, so there you see it, one liberal trope after another. The Jews are brought up again. The Jews are always brought up because that seems to be the Achilles heel, of course, of the Axis powers at the time, Italy being associated, right? Going back to the previous lady that I commented on, I will give her this much credit. She said Italy's role in World War II was much more ambiguous, and this is true. Here, the author here, or the lead guy here in this documentary, actually continues to associate the Nazis, of course, with the Italian fascism, of course, throwing them in the same camp. I have yet to read where Italians shipped political prisoners off to Germany. I have not seen that anywhere. Again, as I said before, in 1943, it was Mussolini protecting Jews from Hitler, both in France and in Yugoslavia. That's what I have read. When it came to the 7,500 or so, again, the Republic of Salo, Mussolini was not the head of Italy anymore. He was the head of a puppet regime in Salo. So there's nuance here. You have to contextualize this properly. But again, this is one trope after another. It's a liberal slant, hardcore, and there's a lot more that can be said about this. Let's continue on.
That this government in power in Italy is occupying your political space?
No, I believe that they are freeing a lot of the political space that we're going to take. Why? One of the main points is immigration. We have always been against immigration. Meloni has always been against immigration, sometimes with our same tone and strength. Now, immigrants this year, have increased the number of 50%. Where do you think Italian people are going to go after this betrayal of original positions?
Your movement, or a movement like yours, would not exist and has been banned in Greece, for example, the Golden Dawn. In Germany, that would never exist. You would never be able to use the symbols and the slogans that your party uses in a country like Germany. Why is that the case?
Because Germany has got a bigger problem.
You think Germany's got the problem rather than Italy?
No, yes, because freedom is freedom.
Okay, let's stop right there. Fascinating that a reporter from the BBC, right, an English, again, a media outlet, would talk about the problems of migration in Italy, right? Because the fascists have always opposed the infiltration of various groups that don't conform, again, to Italian hegemony. This is seen by the BBC as something of a great negative in light of discrimination and racism, and yet the reports coming out of England that I'm hearing today is that England is no longer recognizable, that the English race is being wiped out because of weaponized migration. You go to London, they've elected a Muslim mayor over there. The vast majority of the country is becoming more and more a Muslim. Well, I don't say the vast majority, but there's an ever-growing Muslim population over there, immigrant population over there. They're having children. children. The British indigenous people are not having children over there. They're becoming a strong political force over there. They got their no-go cities over there, which effectively nobody governs other than the Muslims themselves, and that which effectively creates little Muslim countries within England. They say England is unrecognizable because of this weaponized migration. The Italians are trying to avoid this, but notice the bias in the British, in the English reporter here that simply presumes this this generalized tenet of racism and discrimination by the fascist party. Let me ask you a question. Are American conservatives bigots because they want to close down the border because they see similar problems of a lack of American assimilation by those that are rushing in from the southern border? Are they? Would conservatives actually disagree with the fascists on this? Or would they take, again, the liberal side on this? That's what's amazing. Britain, they say, is almost gone, conquered by, migrants from other cultures.
Neither victor nor vanquished. Italy memorializes in a way others do not. The name, architecture, and gestures of the regime allowed to live on.
What do you think? We have to destroy everything. This is the cancel culture that we don't share.
The question is, does the ideology itself survive?
I would say there is a silent majority that would say yes, yes, yes on a lot of our ideas.
And is Italy, the laboratory of fascism, once again a political testing room?
What should be seen as a crime, as apology of fascism, is actually again downplayed as, oh no, it's just nostalgic, it's a tribute.
The worry here is not that it.
Okay, she sounds like an American white girl. I don't know what the deal with her is. It's strange. She doesn't have the accent. She speaks like a liberal American there, right? What should be an apology is some kind of, remembrance thing that, of course, that should be vanquished to the ash heap of history. Of course, it doesn't answer the fundamental question of how you challenge all the progressive movements in Italy. It doesn't answer that problem, right? This is why this documentary is a left-wing Western liberal propaganda piece.
Italy's democracy per se is under threat, but that a governing party which has not severed its historical roots still winks to that support base, and that speech, notions, even policies once banished are increasingly normalized.
Cioè, i fascisti si prendono una rivincita sulla storia e su quello che la storia ha scritto nel 1945, dicendo benissimo noi torniamo al governo, non siamo morti, non siamo spariti, siamo ancora qui. Il famoso filo del passato non è mai stato reciso e continua a non essere reciso.
All right, guys, that's the end of the documentary. Let me stop here, the share. Okay, so I thought this was fascinating. It would be interesting at some point to see a more positive kind of viewpoint of fascism, or at least a more fair perspective, but you just don't get that anywhere. I just don't see it, right? Italian fascism has been vanquished to the ash heap of history primarily because liberalism won after World War II, right? But I think it's pretty easy to read between the lines. The question there at the end is, why does fascism continue to survive in Italy? And I think the question is simple, because it's seen as an opposition force to liberalism, to communism at the end of the day. Where do you turn to, if you're looking for some sense of normalcy, when you're combating things like cultural Marxism within your culture, and really the subjugation of an economic system to an autocratic, bureaucratic government that continues to take more and more control over people's lives. That's why I thought the thing with the pandemic thing was interesting, and even the fact that they're bringing that up, which shows the extreme bias of liberal governments to always highlight how they believe they did the right thing in forcing people's will in, again, you know, I can't say it here in this platform again, but you guys wouldn't know what I'm talking about, right? And so, and I think the more people are suppressed, because again, far leftism, especially in terms of culture and economics, cannot fulfill what people want at the bottom. And this is why you're gonna have, I believe, a nostalgia for fascism in Italy, just like in many ways, in every liberal nation, you're gonna have sort of these quasi-conservative movements that are a remnant of something else from the past where the world made more sense to them, right? That challenges the current status liberal, the status quo, right? And I think that's what's probably happening in Italy. They want something to stand up against this. And fascism has always been that force that has always pushed back against communism. In fact, it's if you look at it historically, whatever you may think of fascism, you may think it's a terrible authoritarian system that suppresses. That's fine if you want to believe that. But in the reality of everyday politics, fascism is still the only force that ever fought back against communism and won, right? And won. And that's why the geopolitics of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s is fascinating, because if the British and the Americans don't get involved, what does the world look like today, right? But again, I think people are always going to look up to fascism in Italy. It's seen as something counter to a nation that's been run into the ground by leftist politics. Democracy has been terrible in Italy. And as long as people are suffering, they're out of work, they can't put bread on the table, they have leftist politics and the culture being destroyed and the faith being destroyed because of liberalism, people are always going to look for something of a deeper meaning, something that touches back on history, tradition, arts, honor, respect, faith, culture, all that stuff that is now missing from the West because it has been stomped on by, again, Western liberalism and communism together teaming up. And people are always going to look to find a way out of this system. So there you have it. You call it a desperation movement, but I think the desperation movements that are happening all over the West now. Just in Italy, it happens in a different fashion. It doesn't come in the light of democracy or representative government, things of that nature. They believe that stuff ultimately fails. Here in America, England, the Western liberal republics, we still present it in that way because we want control, right? Under the dictates of individual rights. In Italy, they're more willing to say, listen, let's just have somebody come in and fix this, because democracy always lends itself to some type of oligarchical rule, some type of plutocratic rule, right? That was one of the things what Mussolini always said about the democracies of the West, that they were plutocracies, system of governance that were controlled by the few, and ultimately why democracy always becomes corrupted in the end and why nothing ever gets done. Remember, they tinkered with democracy in Italy before Mussolini, and it was notoriously corrupt. And I think in retrospect now, here we are some 70, 80 years later, and there's some questions about what's going on in the West today, right? So there you have it. It's my reaction video here to the question of fascism, present day and historically, how Italians see it, ultimately how the Western sort of liberal narrative sees it as well too. I try to be as fair as balanced as I can on all this stuff. I want to thank you for joining me once again. Part 20 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. This is Frank signing off for Frankie Speaking. Good night, everybody.